Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Pynakker, and many of you may recognize this familiar face, Bernadine McCandless, who's been on the show frequently. It's been quite a while since you've last been on, but you have been talked about the whole Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow situation. You are neighbors with them, with Chad, and you brought a very unique perspective to this. And plus, this is the only podcast you'll go on to talk about it. And so I wanted to thank Bernadine McCandless for coming back on the program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we appreciate now. Bernadine was having trouble. Now, this is, I interview a lot of rural people, and unfortunately, sometimes internet can be a little tough. So she had to actually drive into town so she could use her cell signal because she wasn't getting a good signal at her home with her Wi-Fi. And so, just want to give people there might be a little pause there, but we'll get through this. And I want to welcome my special guest, Gregory Graf, who's been on the program before, actually with the Idaho Potatoes. What is the name of your political podcast?
It's Political Potatoes. It's a
Political Potatoes.
Substack.
That's right, Political Potatoes. But also, folks, is actually with the East Idaho News. And I want to just pop up their website because this has actually been an invaluable resource during these periods of time. I know that actually when I've been covering the story on my channel, a lot of same audience were also getting their information from East Idaho News. And so they've been keeping people updated. But this is actually just a great resource for all things Eastern Idaho and even just in the Intermountain West. And it's a great resource that I've used and Bernadine has. And you, how long have you been doing East Idaho News, Greg?
Sorry, I don't work for East Idaho News. I have my own business. I work closely with, and I
Okay.
know the people at East Idaho News. I was with a different company that
Okay. I
was
thought
closely aligned.
you're closely
Sorry.
aligned. Okay. I
Yeah, yeah.
apologize for the misconception there, but it's a great resource.
It
And
is.
Greg,
It's an excellent website.
so, Greg, I just wanted to kind of get your perspective. Of course, you're really plugged into East Idaho culture, the political scene, but also just kind of the milieu that is that world. And maybe maybe give your thoughts on what happened this week in Arizona with the guilty verdict of Lori Vallow. Love to hear your perspective on this.
Certainly. So, not surprised by the verdict, right? Lori Vallow's behavior, her affiliation with that cult-like behavior, and her connection to Chad and everything. When you read the stories, and I want to say one of the best books on this was the one by Leah Satelli called "When the Moon Turns to Blood." She tells an incredible story and really dives deep into the details of just how deranged their ideology was and how they use these manipulative tactics and everything else to get what they wanted. And just something that I've observed in my years of tracking extremism here in Idaho, mostly on the political side, but there's a lot of connection points between the cult-like ideologies and the religious aspects and the political aspects of what's happening here in Idaho and extremism. So, not surprised by the verdict. Just, deeply abusive and deranged people. This is what they do when they are, allowed to go this far.
Yeah, that's so true. So, Bernadine, I just wanted to get your perspective because you've been following this closely uh, for years. You've had association with family members, your kids, and everything like this. So, this is really you deeply embedded in your world, and you've been watching this trial very closely. I just want to get your thoughts on this verdict, and was it surprising to you?
No, it wasn't surprising to me, but I was nervous a little bit because of how little the jury knew about well, nothing, right, about what had happened in Idaho. They kept everything focused on what had happened in Chandler. And I thought, gosh, if so much of the evidence was circumstantial, and I thought if they knew about what had happened in Idaho and how many people she'd killed up there, then it would be a slam dunk.
Oh, Bernadine, you
And so I was worried. Uh,
Oh, Bernadine, you started breaking up there.
Hello?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, try. I think you're good now. Just to finish your thought.
Okay. Okay. I think that a lot of the way she behaved in court um, helped them to see what sort of person she was, and that she was nonchalant enough to be able to do this and not care, kill somebody and not care.
Yeah, and I know I was reading one of the jury members says that her being her own attorney did herself no favors. What would you say to that, Bernadine?
I would agree. She presented no facts. The way that there were so many places she could have objected because she'd interview and question and allow the witnesses to go on and on and on and give a lot of harmful information to her. Do you know what I mean? And instead of, yes and no answers or whatever, there were a lot of things that were said that I think showed everybody, the jury, that she was bad news. Case statement um, at the end of her testimony, um, where Lori said to her, "Did you see me do this? And did you hear me do this?" And Kay said, "No, but I've sure seen a lot of evidence that you did." Statements like that, I think, really harmed Lori. And, I think the same thing's going to happen with the Brendan Boudreau case.
Yeah, that's so true. So, Greg, I wanted to get your thoughts. Like, I think one of the few times I've ever heard, it's kind of interesting when I think of people defending themselves in a murder trial, I often think of Ted Bundy and how he did that. And actually, I remember even the judge kind of being complimentary towards him, but he actually had some legal training. And so he was somewhat effective in his defense. But this, it sounds to me, was just absolute disaster with Lori. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the old saying, he who represents himself has a fool for a client, right? It's a classic case of the hubris of individuals who think themselves above the law, above others, holding dominion over others, and that somehow they can bend reality to their will, right? You see this in a lot of individuals who just it's kind of the drinking their own Kool-Aid. They've done that so much. They've told the story to themselves so much that they believe it, that they really thought they could get away with this, right? That you're looking at Lori and how she behaved in throughout the trials and everything else. It's that weird line. Does she actually believe she did something wrong or not? I don't know. It's disturbing, very, very disturbing. And when you see that behavior, that mindset of someone just so far gone, it's hard to watch. But I think the jury saw through it, saw what it was, and she had no real legal training or expertise, and she's not a persuasive person, in my opinion. Like when you listen to Chad and others, and some of their writings and their speech patterns, everything else, he comes across as a little more persuasive than she does.
Yeah, and speak to that too is just the whole thing with the charisma of like a cult leader and how they're able to manipulate people into doing terrible things or allowing terrible things to happen. Maybe speak to how that played a role in this whole thing too, Greg.
Certainly. And actually, I had an article recently where I was comparing a political leader in North Idaho who was involved in an incident where there was a woman was dragged out of a town hall meeting. When you look at the writing style, what they say versus like someone say Jim Jones, right? The cult leader where 900 people died after drinking the cyanide laced Kool-Aid. There are certain things that are said and done, specifically aligning with this us versus them thought process, right? I can help you from these horrible people who I've told you are the enemy. They're coming to get us. They're out for us. You don't listen to what anyone else says but us because everyone else is just lying about us, right? Those are the things that someone who subscribes to cult like thinking and utilizes those manipulative language and those narratives will use to get people in, right? And they do things like trauma bonding and other things. And you saw that if you go back and read the whole Daybell story. There's a lot of that with the people's in their inner circle. They would be incredibly abusive to them, and then like bringing them back in the fold, and uh, just their ability to get people to buy into the gaslighting and the lies. And at some point, someone is so invested in it that even when they hear something that just doesn't make sense or isn't true, they're like, but I'm so invested in this. It's got to be because I'm just so far into this. And so listening to, of course, Lori and Chad's being kind of a de facto leader of this group, it it just mirrors so many other cults you see. There's Nexium, there was the Jonestown one. There's been a bunch over the years, Waco, whatever. They all follow similar patterns. There's always some sort of doomsday end of the world thing going on. That's the high level thing. We're preparing for this, hence why they aligned with groups like Preparing a People and a Vow, which were deeply embedded in end of the world prepping, which was something you saw a lot of in East Idaho, which a lot of people would consider North Utah. Idaho, of course, has a broader population and spectrum. Sorry, I think my camera cut out and I don't know why. Let me shift that. You can still hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you just fine.
Okay, let me fix that camera issue. Don't know why I did that. Okay, let me switch over to my other
Yeah, that's fine. And while you're
camera.
fixing
Yeah.
that, we'll talk to Bernadine. Bernadine, let's maybe speak to the whole cult thing that the manipulation that was going on. It's incredible. You saw some of it firsthand.
Yes, I think that, and I don't want to blame this on any one church, right? But I think that we are raised in the LDS church to not question. There's the Adam scripture is quoted a lot. I know not save the Lord commanded me, right? So you don't question, you just follow. And I think that she really used that technique to get people to do what she wanted them to do. And then also, because some of these women that testified, for instance, I thought, well, you're a pretty educated sounding person. So how did you think it was okay to decide somebody was a zombie, for instance, right? And I think that cult like atmosphere, kind of uh, uh, like a lot of pressure, end of times. We have to do this quickly. This um, emphasis on getting it done right now because things are going to happen in July, which was when they thought that the world was going to come to an end. I think that had a huge influence on
Okay, you broke up
putting
again,
pressure
Bernadine.
on people
Oh, yeah, and I'm
to
going to
do things that shouldn't have been done.
and I want to speak to that too because like
I
you were
I
saying,
watched
Greg.
an Keith Morris interview. A
So, Bernadine, you're having some issues on your end, so just real quick, but we did catch the gist of what we were saying about the control and everything like that with cults and like how you can demonize somebody into that's calling them a zombie. We see the exact same tactics, Greg, when we see when an us versus them mindset is out there, you if you can dehumanize the other, you can justify doing terrible things to those people. And I think that's really kind of foundational to how they were able to do this brainwashing to the point that you could literally become convinced that your children are no longer human. And you've seen this throughout history, and unfortunately, we sometimes see this even happening in modern times. Maybe speak to that, Greg.
Yes, you're right. The dehumanizing is a critical part of any leader that wants to gain control over someone else, right? You need an enemy. You need to say these are the bad people, right? They're coming to get us, and I have created a system, a path. No, I possess some secret knowledge, whatever it is, to convince this group that you have something to protect them from this threat, and then really lean into the idea that you want to that this threat is imminent, and that it is dangerous,
Hmm.
and it's going to affect the things that you care most about, your family, your values, etc. And something Bernadine touched upon, which I've seen happen so many times, is the ability of individuals who understand this idea that those raised with Christian values, those raised in the LDS Church, are taught that contention is a sin, right? You don't, you want to avoid conflict. And they don't, most people don't understand that there's a difference between conflict and contention, right? Conflict is dealing with issues and situations where you're confronting something, and that can be, in conflict with something. But contention is creating drama. It's creating things, often intentionally. Okay, so someone who understands that individuals avoid or taught to avoid and also not question leadership, not question, in this case, the one they really leaned into was not question personal revelation, right? Don't you dare talk, go against these things that you've been raised since a child to believe. So when someone has no qualms with saying, you know what, if I just make something up and say it's this, it's personal revelation, it's this, this person's not going to question me. And that gives me almost complete power and control to do whatever I want.
Mhm.
And it gets in that idea of dominion, right? And you hear different thought process about dominionism and things like that, which I see in the political, the Christian nationalism spectrum here in Idaho. So without narrowing this on people within the LDS culture, because it applies to people across the spectrum in Christianity, that individuals who want to manipulate, who want to take control or power or gain authority over to other people, the easiest path is to be confrontational on purpose, to use conflict, to use contention, to prey upon people's belief systems where they're not questioning authority and control.
And I think it's so interesting too, because I want to also just make it very clear that this is not just something that happens in the LDS
Hmm.
world. I want to give a couple examples so people understand. Harold Camping was a cult leader who predicted the end of the world a few times. He comes from a Reformed tradition, which is the same Christian Reformed tradition that my family came from. And then Jim Jones comes from the Pentecostal tradition, which I kind of have a connection to. So we can see that no one group can be excluded. The Anabaptists early days in Munster, Germany were practicing polygamy, and they kind of became a death cult. So we know that all the traditions of Christianity can have these manifestations. Bernadine, you wanted to say something?
No, you're good. I agree with what you're saying, and one of the things the trial focused on was, her Nephi connection, like Nephi. She's doing things like Nephi, right?
Yep.
But
Hmm.
other groups have used other scriptures out of the Bible, to be able to commit crime also. So you're correct. It's not just a LDS thing. I think this one, I think one of the reasons that this is so public is that it is somewhat out of character for LDS people to behave this way, and it is so connected. There's just so much about it that it involved three states, um, meaning Utah, Arizona, and Idaho, and I think that it is just it is so surprising that it's part of the reason it's so public.
Yeah, it's so sad. I'm glad we got you pretty decent signal. So I want to ask you another question. Last year, when you were on the program, you had talked about how there's other suspicious deaths that surround this thing that may also should maybe be looked at or maybe never will be looked at. But you have your suspicions that there may have been more murdering going on than even what's been officially put out there.
Yes. Well, the first one that comes to mind is her husband previous to Charles Vallow, right? Joe Ryan. I think that she probably murdered him. But our neighbor, Eldon Clausen, he disappeared a week after JJ's death and burial. And he was a water master that walked that ditch right where JJ was buried. He also died of a pulmonary embolism, which is what they say, like her brother died of, Lori's brother died of. But he was also the insurance guy involved with this whole thing. And I think he saw something and they took him out.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a fun person. So,
Yeah, I know
I'm,
there were some
you know,
conflicts there between them and everything
yeah,
like that.
yeah. And so but when I talked to Fremont County about it, they said we just have too much going on. This trial in Idaho, I don't know if it was Lori and Chad or just Lori's. The Idaho one cost between $3 and $4 million. So, there isn't the budget to go after everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, the resources that would take to reopen some of these cases and everything like that. And of
Hmm.
course, Chad and Lori are in jail. Do you think, Greg, just being somebody who's plugged into the East Idaho community, what do you think is going to be, what has been kind of like the result, like what kind of effect has had this had on the community? And do you foresee that this is something that's really caused people to really maybe do a lot of self-examination and stuff like that? Because it seemed like there were a lot of people that were supporting Chad and Lori, and then just to see all these horrible things happen, what kind of effect did it have on the community?
So I lived 10 years in Idaho Falls, which of course is just south of Rexburg area by a little bit, right there in East Idaho. And I was dialed into that community really well. And I had heard so many fascinating, crazy stories about, and this goes not just the Daybells, but the broader movement, right? It started with the prepping community, a vow, preparing a people, whatever these groups were. And without singling out individuals or anything like that. What I saw was you have this group, movement, community, we'll call it a community, um, that was involved in some really interesting things, right? So if you're following along with the story of how the Daybells needed to get their visions, right? This is all about the writing books on near-death experiences. And in order to write a book and have a story, you have to have some sort of near death experience. And so as I heard what was going on, is it wasn't just that, people were, you can't really manufacture a near death experience without some sort of suicide attempt or something like that. So someone along the way came up with this idea that, we could make some sort of like drug based cough syrup, some sort of serum that you would drink, and I don't know what was in it. But think about some sort of hallucinogenic properties to this that would cause you to have visions. And you see this in Native American communities, and different drugs are available that aid with that, and that's fine. But these are individuals who had no business or expertise or experience or medical training to do so. And as a result, I had a friend tell me that they witnessed a coworker of theirs, worked at the local university, young guy, probably in his early to mid 30s, dropped dead of a heart attack right there. And later learned that this guy was involved in all this. And the suspicion was that he'd been drinking something maybe he shouldn't. Other things that were going on were I had noticed that people who were involved in the local political community that were more aligned, I would say, far right. their rumors of their involvement, and hearing that. And I think that the craziest thing was the idea that, and if you're familiar with the LDS community and LDS doctrine and thought process of celestial marriage, right? You are married in the temple, you're sealed for time and eternity, and that someone like Lori and Chad would meet up in the inside the temple in the top level, the celestial room, and discuss how, well, I had a vision that we were together in the pre-existence, and that was the justification for them to have a extramarital affair. Well, that idea became somewhat popular, and the rumors that were flying around in this community was that effectively that little group was essentially a sex cult. And that the individuals involved were learning this behavior like, hey, you know what? That's a really great loophole to have an affair or to start some sort of swinging or something like that. And so, I had heard stories that people were, and once again, can't confirm what these are, salacious rumors, whatever we want to say, but they're interesting. That people were going so far as to hiring contractors to build rooms in their homes specifically for this sort of behavior to be done in secret. And once again, this is a small community. Bonneville County, which is the larger county where Idaho falls, includes the town of Ammon, heading up north towards Rigby and I think what was that Lincoln, just Jefferson County, Madison County. Madison County is Rexburg, that area, and that's where BYU Idaho is hosted. That's probably one of the largest employers up there. So just looking at the community, the religious makeup of the community, very high LDS population, and that people talk, right? And when you're tapped in and you hear people talking about, well, did you hear so and so was involved with a vow or this or whatever? It's like, yeah, I could see that. That makes sense, especially when you look at the other things they're doing in their public life, um, which were found to be pretty abusive in other ways. So, to answer your specific question, what was the impact when those bodies were found? All those people that are watching that I suspected of being involved in this community, they immediately went quiet about all this. It had a chilling effect amongst the community. I think everyone like suddenly backed off from whatever they're doing, and like it wasn't about them taking a good hard look about the behavior or whether this is right or wrong. I think it was more self-serving of I don't want to be associated with that because that could hurt my job. That could hurt my standing in the community. So everyone, I believe that was involved very closely, suddenly went very quiet about all of that. And to this day, a few years later now, you don't hear anything about it. It's very, very quiet. It all just went really dark really fast. I remember reading the individuals who were involved with setting up the website, right? The Eval website. They were dialed in pretty closely with some other political people and watching them just kind of their communication across Facebook and these other places. It all just kind of went quiet, right? You weren't seeing the same signals you used to see. Just really interesting. So to your point, I think it did have a chilling effect on the community, but I think it was very self-serving of people just trying to CYA.
Yeah, it sounds like, Bernadine, I just wanted to maybe just get you give the kind of just give your final thoughts on this whole thing. This has been an incredible journey that you've been on, living with Chad, but near Chad and being involved, knowing many of the people involved in this. How has it been for you just to go through this whole thing? I mean, how have you been able to process it and what kind of effect has it had on your psyche and your faith and all that kind of stuff?
It really shook me up because I was raised that you seek the mysteries of God. You go to the temple, you dig for the deeper things, right? The deeper layers, the things that they aren't talking about in a general conference, almost like parable language. You're looking for something more that doesn't go against your faith, but that is part of it, but I'm not a huge prepper. I'm not um uh I'm not even sure that I believe in the whole New Jerusalem thing in Missouri, and that is a huge thing, right? So, but there were things that Lori Vallow, Julie Rowe, and I never read the Julie Rowe stuff. I never got into that, but that they would, I sometimes I would believe something, and then one of them would say it, and I'd go, oh, okay, maybe I'm not off the track, that far off the, you know, my ideas aren't that way out there. Other people are obviously thinking this too. And I can't think of a specific thing right now. But when this happened, it made me shut down. Like, okay, I'm reading the book of Psalms and nothing else because look at what happened, you know? And I had to understand within myself, okay, but you're not thinking, you're not a swinger. You're not a, you know, which I think a lot of them were, frankly. You're not a murderess. You're not out trying to steal anybody's husband. You're not, you know, I had to go through these things in my brain and say, you're not part of this because some of these ideas seemed like, for instance, you know, Buddhism, Lori calls it past lives. What do they call it?
Multiple
You
mortal
know, they
incarnations.
yeah, they believed in that stuff, but I haven't ever thrown out the idea that possibly progress, we do have more than one life to be able to progress if we're supposed to achieve perfection, right? How do you do that in one life? So I had thought, well, that would make sense if somebody says that they, you know, we come back again or whatever. Didn't totally believe it, but I was open to the idea. Then when this happened this way, it made me question if I could trust any idea other than what the church said. But at the same time, I have always been somebody that questioned everything, right? I'm never going to just follow the prophet because he's the prophet, right? And so it took me on a journey that what I decided for myself is that I'm not part of any one religion. I will, if I go to the temple and I study things in the temple and that makes sense to me and it feels right, I'll follow that. If I go over and I go to the metaphysics church here in Buffalo and they say something that I'm like, you know, that's a really cool idea, then I'm going to investigate that idea. But I learned that for me, I can't just stick with one religion and just follow haplessly, you know. And so in a way, it's confusing because I joined the LDS Church when I was 9 years old, and so very ingrained in this is the only true church and this is the only way you do things, right? I had to say I can't accept that. And I had to talk to the bishop and the stake president and say, if you're okay with me coming, that's cool, but I can't believe that. There's parts of paganism that I love, that I embrace, right? And but I can't just follow everything blindly anymore.
Well, I think that's really had an effect. So this affected you very personally on your own faith
Very.
journey because you were so connected to this community. I think it's really important we don't lose sight of this. This is more than just headlines that we're watching on, true crime podcasts and stuff like that, or on court TV. These are real people, and the effect that these horrible actors can do on a community and hurt other people's lives, the collateral damage more than just the murder victims, but there's some it can hurt and harm an entire community and cause PTSD and people having serious mental health issues as a result. I think it's really important that we remember that there's more than just the victims we talk about in court. There's also people that have been neighbors and friends and colleagues of these people whose lives were also greatly affected as well. Greg, did you have any final words before we wrap this up?
Yes. So I was listening to what you were saying. It got me thinking. Just going back to location, right? Idaho. Idaho has this history of, you have a cult-like group start up, something happens, it collapses. Okay. But you got to realize that all the other people involved didn't go away. They're still there, right? They just disassociated, dealing with the fallout, making different choices with their life, whatever they're doing, or they've just gone dark. They're still around, right? All those lessons they learned, all the behavior they observed, everything that they were taught and witnessed, um, it's still with them, right? And my concern is how long before someone else starts something up similar. They have all the tools. They know it works. They know they can form a community around something and maybe like, well, okay, the zombie thing, maybe that was a little too far. Let's just take that out, right? Whatever that is. How long before you see this pop
Mhm.
up? And I say this because I'll use another example, similar but different. In North Idaho, you had Richard Butler start the Aryan Nations up in Hayden Lake. We all know the story, right? There was a movie recently with Jude Law called The Order. Fantastic movie, by the way, which paints that story about some of the violence that happened up there in Richard Butler and everything else. Now, they were eventually shut down through lawsuits and they lost millions of dollars in lawsuits, bankrupted, and the whole thing was literally torn down because the property was bought at auction by an individual who donated it and there's a famous picture of the bulldozer ripping apart the building with the swastika on it, right? So they were shut down, but the people never went away. And now we're seeing the elements of that rising up again. They're not wearing swastikas. They're not openly saying they're Nazis, but they have podcasts. They have social media presence. They're very loud and very effective. And you know what? They literally are getting people elected in Idaho. And that was Richard Butler's plan, right? Take over government. So how long before? And so we're seeing that rising, but they've learned some of their lessons and they're more careful about what they do, staying within the elements of law. Thankfully, no one's getting murdered. But there's a lot of coercion. There's a lot of threats of violence. There's a lot of intimidation tactics, things like that are happening. And I'm worried that take the East Idaho, going back to the Chad and Lori Daybell cult. Um, how long before someone else who is associated with that starts something new? And what does that look like? And I'm worried that it might be more dangerous in that, yes, you're not seeing people get killed, but how many people do they lead into that and to what end?
Excellent point. Excellent point. Bernadine, did you
Yeah.
want to share?
Yeah, I'm seeing a little bit of funky stuff here in Missouri.
Hmm.
And there's a Facebook group, it's called Utah to Missouri, and
Mm,
it's people moving to Missouri from Utah. And some of the things that people will say or post, there's a lot of church history up around Adirondack and
mm,
Independence and so on. Um, Comments like, "No, I live within 2 miles of Adirondack, and I live within 3 minutes of Adirondack," or like there's a lot of this cultural stuff like I'm more special. We're going to be right there. I've got to get there before anybody else does. And just some of the comments that are made, religious comments on there, I'm like, oh my gosh, does history repeat itself? You know?
hey, Bernadine, at least we have some uh, safety in knowing that when they get there, they won't have great internet connections. They won't be able to spread their message as well.
Exactly.
Oh, that's great. That's great, Greg. I really appreciate it. And I also, just real quick, folks, I wanted to share, if this is another great resource, the Political Potatoes podcast. He also has this Substack as well. Check out Greg's work that he does. It's really important. I've had Greg on before talking about the rise of Christian nationalism in Idaho and some of the concerns that people have about that. And so that's a great resource to go by. And Bernadine, you know what? We powered through it. We were able to hear most of what you had to say. And Greg, your camera went off for a little bit, so we powered through this all together. And I really want to appreciate both of you. I appreciate my friendship with you, Bernadine. I still have in my phone says Bernardine car ride because you had offered to pick me up once at the airport early days in Missouri. And so that's how I
Yep.
had you in there. I still have you there in there as Bernadine car ride at the time. But you've
Good.
been such a wonderful person in my life, and I want to thank you and honor you for coming on this program and sharing your story. I think you give a very unique and important perspective on this whole situation.
Thank you. I
And
love
Greg,
you.
I love you too, Bernadine. And Greg, I just want to say I really appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And I'm glad to have you back on and would like to continue having these conversations. I think that the story is far from over, folks. I think there's many, many, many more stories that we're going to be covering that will involve a lot of these interesting things. And again, I think this is a safe space where we can all have these important conversations and also make sure that, religion can be a wonderful thing. Spirituality can be a beautiful thing. But then there are times when people will try to then give distort it or lead you in a certain direction, and that's where discernment comes in. Sometimes I think people think they have discernment, and when they realize they don't, that's when or maybe they never realize they actually didn't have it, and they get caught up in things like this. So it's really important to, step back, folks, when you start getting involved in groups that are getting into some of this weird stuff. Don't just kind of be careful. I just want to say this is with anybody that's in any kind of religion. We've discussed the Nexium cult here on this channel. We've talked about other different movements as well. And so this is not just something that's an LDS thing. This is all across the board. And so be very careful out there. Thank you both of you for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
And folks, just want to remind you that we do have links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. I also have a link to the East Idaho News website, as well as to Greg's wonderful podcast, Political Potatoes, and his Substack. And Bernadine and Greg, I hope you guys have a great weekend. Thank you for coming out the last minute. We'll be posting this today. It's 1:17 Eastern Time on April 24th. As soon as I get this thing uploaded, I'll release it on Mormon Book Reviews, so stay tuned for further updates on this breaking story. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.